Up to this moment, all I can think about is that night. The night he came to me. The night he stood in my corner and watched me with those burning crimson eyes. And then he stood at the end of my bed with his arms outstretched, waiting for me to dare reach forward, touch the tips of his little black fingers. This little boy, this demon, had been with me since I was 5 years old. Although, until I was about 20, did I ever give him a thought. My mother would call him my imaginary friend. He would come to me at night when the moon slashed through my window at a perfect angle, and he would stand in the corner of my room. I never got to see his full body. It was like he was nothing but a shadow with eyes. His figure always seemed to me in a permanent silhouette, where the only thing I could see would be his outline. When I turned 10, my mother decided that it was time for me to forget about such childish things. I could remember that day almost as if it had happened the day before. Well, I could now, thinking about it. The night I stopped responding to his whispers was the night he left me for a whole 10 years. And for a whole 10 years, I hadn't thought of him or any memories that involved him, including the day my mother howled at me for continuing to speak to him at night. I tried to tell her that he wasn't imaginary. I was old enough now to discern what my mind produced. It was physically standing in front of me every night for 5 years, whispering secrets about things I can't remember. It started about a week ago. Thinking about it now, I should have known that something would go wrong, besides the topic of my visitation. It was my mother's funeral. That woman hadn't left our old family home, even after I moved out and flew away to a completely different state. I loved my mother, don't get me wrong, but she could be a real nightmare. I wasn't particularly depressed about the funeral, and even as I stood there in front of her casket, waiting for those hulking men to drop her into the dirt, I couldn't sense an overwhelming feeling of dread. It was indifference that pervaded my body. Mostly my pain at visiting my old home and staying in my old bedroom irked me. My father crying through the walls as I lay in my bed that remained too small for me. It was raining the day of the funeral. My mother's casket and the rest of the saddened group were under an awning that was erected in haste by the men directed by the priest. It was shiny black wood, polished to perfection to where you could see your own reflection perfectly on its lid. I stared at myself in that reflection. I wouldn't have been surprised if my eyes hadn't burned a hole in the side with my gaze. For 20 minutes, as the priest read his excerpts, I did nothing but stare at that reflection. My reflection, or at least I thought it was my reflection. As it turns out, I was transfixed. My eyes held themselves unblinking in place on a figure standing beside me. The grayscale of the clouds and the wet sky distracted me as I finally came to realization for a moment, to notice the figure of a little boy with red eyes crouched underneath my arm. As I slept that night, I couldn't get the image out of my head. You'd figure it was bright enough outside to be able to see through a shadow, but apparently not, for his darkness was the only piece of that day that haunted me. It was the third day staying at my old home, and my senses finally began to regain themselves. I guess you could call it shock, and my shock shone brightly to the point where I was glad my father was grocery shopping when I went to the bathroom later in that afternoon. I was a strange little boy, I guess I should point that out. Whenever I went to the bathroom, I never turned on the overhead light until I began washing my hands. Ugh, damn, I wish I had turned on that light. Because as I stepped into that bathroom and opened the lid of the toilet, I noticed something strange about the way the light from outside traveled in through the darkness of the bathroom. It seemed to bend around something behind me, and I noticed it looking up into the mirror to see the little boy standing beside me, looking up with piercing red eyes, gazing into mine. I damn near pissed all over the wall as I saw him. I flew over to the light to turn it on, but as the light splashed around the room, he disappeared. Let's just say, I made sure to turn on the light almost as soon as I stepped into the bathroom from that moment onward. That night in bed was when the memories began to invade my brain. Has that ever happened to you? When you see something that was significant to your childhood, like a toy or a movie, and you start to drown in memories of when you would use it? That night was basically like that, but more frightening. I guess that when you're a kid, you don't realize the magnitude of some situations, and I was never scared of this boy when I was little. But now, as an adult, it was freaky as all hell. His name, Maldron. Maldron. It kept repeating itself in my dreams. I woke up the next morning practically yelling it. It was day 4 at home, passing uneventfully. All I did was sit in the living room dwelling on old memories of this little boy. The only thing it seemed I couldn't remember was the things he used to tell me. I just knew that he used to whisper to me, things he would whisper that made my blood flow faster and make my skin tingle. He came to me that night. I had barely had time to settle into bed before I saw him. He was in the exact same corner he would always stand, his eyes burning into mine. I didn't scream, I didn't gasp, I didn't make any sound at all. I just sat up and stared back with the blankets pulled up to my chin. It felt slightly reminiscent of the position I would once sit in when he would come to me at night as a child. Maldron. My brain kept repeating his name, eventually yelling it to the point where I almost wanted to reach up and cover my ears as if it would have helped. It was only 5 minutes. It would have kept going, and I almost wanted it to, until I made the mistake of blinking. He was gone within a second, but even after his little body had gone from the corner, allowing the moon to caress its sharp curve, I kept imagining I could see the little red dots that were his eyes. It took me 2 more hours to drift into sleep. I woke in the same position I had fallen asleep, my knees pulled up in the blanket around my chin with my hands in my lap. It was day 5 at home. I would leave the next day. I repeatedly stepped into my father's room to see him weeping over photos of my mother, photos of me. We hadn't spoken more than 2 words to each other over the entirety of my visit. I remembered the night he first came to me. My grandmother had told me of a little dark boy who enjoyed speaking to other boys his age. She described his eyes, and his eyes only, and how he would come to you at night to tell you things, to tell you secrets. She told me that I would see this little boy soon, because she had told me of him. That was all it took. He just needed to be described, and he could find you. God, I don't understand why she would tell me if that happened. But he came again that night. I saw him at the end of my bed. And as the moon shone brightly, casting a silvery glow from behind him, I saw him move. His arms reaching up to touch me, his little fingers edging closer to me. He opened his mouth, but all I could hear was a small whistle, like the sound of wind attempting to escape a bottle. Oh, how I wanted to reach forward and touch those fingers. I just wanted to embrace him, even though I was so scared of him. I fought myself not to raise my arm. The things he could do, my imagination raced with itself. But I blinked again. His little red eyes and tiny arms disappeared in a split second. I found myself crying myself to sleep. I got home a few hours ago. I got to bed early tonight due to fatigue. And I regret to inform you that I've been sitting in bed for the past 8 minutes recording this. Maldron is staring at me. He's right in front of me, but this will all be over soon, and I'm so sorry to all of you listening to this. Because, as I said, all it takes for him to find you is a description. And I think I've provided you with quite enough.